I think the roster of care is obviously such an important tool to get your head around and to understand the implications of that. But it kind of then comes back to the disability worker cost model as well, and understanding how this applies specifically in SIL. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it fits in?
Yes. So the disability cost model is designed to estimate the total costs of operating a business within the NDIS. So it takes into account the labour, the on costs with those labour.
And so I've seen, I'm sure you've seen more than me, but I've seen quite a lot of times where a participant needs one-on-one supports, but they're only funded to one-on-2 supports.
That's right. Yes.
Or 1-on-3 supports. And the provider has to almost pick up the slack of providing that extra staff at their own cost, because if they don't, the participant's going to be endangered or a staff member's going to be endangered. And so is there another way?
Every SIL provider knows the challenges: compliance, rosters, claims. But what if you could work smarter, grow faster, and make a bigger impact? Welcome to SILosophy, where we have real conversations about what it takes to succeed in supported independent living. This podcast is powered by Tania Gomez Consulting and Resolve. Let's get into it.
Hey Melissa, thanks for coming in today.
Thanks, Tania. Thanks for having me.
So for those, today I want to talk about understanding SIL financials. To me, SIL is overly complex in lots of ways, but the finances are just so different from every other area of the NDIS. And I wanted to talk to you, an expert in the space, about understanding SIL financials. But before we talk about that, I first just want you to tell everyone who might not have had the pleasure of meeting you yet a little bit about your background, what you do in the space, and a little bit about your business.
Great. Thanks, Tania. So you could tell from the name of my business, Avanti Accountants, I'm an accountant and I work predominantly with NDIS providers to help them with their compliance and tax work, which we have to do, but also to help them understand their numbers, look at where there might be some pain points within their business, and help them navigate how they can improve their business from a financial point of view, in particular with navigating things like the NDIS price guide, the SCHADS Award, and other tips and tricks and things to help them improve their profitability and long-term viability.
Yeah, amazing. Perfect. I think that is just so important. For me, I know most people think compliance from my compliance stuff is so incredibly hard work. But when I think about accounting, like I think there's nothing more important in a business than having a good accountant by your side. Certainly, I couldn't navigate anything without an accountant's help, because numbers can be, they're so important, but they're just also so complicated, right? It's so complicated. There's so many things, so many variables, and there doesn't seem to be a really clear way to understand them simply. There's a lot involved, things like tax implications and things like, payroll implications and all these other things. It's really unfortunate that you can't just look at the money in your bank account to know if you're actually okay or not. And I know some people that is their measure, but it's actually not a true measure, right?
That's
because
absolutely right.
There's so many things in that can impact that. So I think what you do is incredibly important, and it's so great to have an expert in NDIS specifically. I wanted to first ask you about the impact of ratios specifically for SIL finances. And so what I mean by that is, in a SIL home, you can have a ratio of 1 participant to 1 staff member, 1 participant to 2 staff members, 1 participant to 3 staff members, or you can have 1 support worker to 1 participant, 1 support worker to 2 participants, 1 support worker to 3 participants. And so those ratios have a really big impact on the actual money that you're receiving. Can you talk to me about some best practices for managing this ratio and why it's important to have thought about?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing that it comes back to, of course, is looking at the roster of care that you've put in place for the participant, for understanding what needs that they have for services within their house. And then after, assuming that's all approved and it comes through, then looking at the budgeting or the amount of funds that's been made available to the participant for the period, for the year, assuming that's the length of the plan. Then it's important that as you then assign your staff or work out your roster of the staff assignment throughout the day in the house with the participants, that you monitor the costs of how much it will cost you in wages to deliver the supports throughout that period, to ensure that there's going to be enough funds from the participants to cover those costs. And if you look at it as a full house scenario as well, so you'll be looking at, if you've got more than one participant in the house, you'll be looking at the profitability of the house as a whole, and then how you can manage that roster to ensure that you're providing the adequate care that's needed for all the participants, but also in a cost-effective manner.
Yeah. And I think the roster of care is obviously such an important tool to get your head around and to understand the implications of that. But it kind of then comes back to the disability worker cost model as well, and understanding how this applies specifically in SIL. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it fits in?
Yes. So the disability cost model is designed to estimate the total costs of operating a business within the NDIS. So it takes into account the labour, the on costs with those labour, so superannuation, workers' comp, and then also your other business overheads, such as your insurances, your office rent, your accounting fees, your subscriptions to CRMs, your compliance audits, and so forth. That worker cost model actually does not allow very much margin at all in this sector, to the point that the labour component on its own takes up 70% of the hourly rate that you're paid for the supports, which is a huge amount when you think about it from a business point of view. There's only 30% left over to cover your overheads and have some profit. So it's really important that you get your rostering correctly for your staff and monitor your other overhead costs to keep it as lean as possible, so that you ensure that you have a viable business that can last.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does things like what's the impact of things like overtime and public holiday rates on your profit levels or on your cash flow levels?
Yeah, so it's very easy to, if you've got staff that are sick, or if you've rostered poorly, to go into overtime and so forth with your staff. And because overtime is paid at 1.5 times the hourly rate for the first 2 hours, and then double time for over that, it chews into the margin very, very quickly. In fact, if you're paying a lot of overtime at the 2 times rate, then you're basically running at a loss for that hour each support that you're providing. So it is critical that you are monitoring and keeping tabs on the hours and the overtime that's being provided to the staff.
Yeah. And what's the easiest way to do that? How does someone actually manage what staff they have on when? And, if someone calls in sick, how do they make sure they've got the most effective replacement of staff?
Mm-hmm. So there are great CRMs available that you can do with rostering of your staff. So as you develop the roster for the week, it will then provide you a report of what the costs will be for the wages based on that roster. And then you can adjust the hours, adjust the start times and finish times and so forth, to then see how those will work. But I recommend that you learn the SCHADS Award, those key things like understanding when the hourly rate shifts from a standard day rate to the afternoon rate, and then to the evening rate, for example, and just watching the times that you're putting staff's start and finish times to monitor that. Yeah, coming back to the question, the ideally having a process in place where you calculate out the roster, and you're not always going to get it right. There's going to be times when there's going to be overtime paid, because if a staff calls in sick or something, that you might not have any other options. But if you're aware of, you might have a choice between 1 or 2 staff members. If you can look at what other hours that they've had during the week already, you can then try and choose appropriately to keep the costs correctly. bearing in mind it also has to match and suit the participants. So
yeah. There's just so much there, isn't there?
Yes.
There's just so many variables, and every little lever you pull will save you some money, or every little lever you don't pull is going to be costing you quite a lot of money.
That's right. And we always, like these conversations, it's always like it's black and white, numbers only, but there's people involved in this. And so you've got to also remember that you've got to make it work, that you're matching the right support worker with the right participant that's going to meet their needs. And that also means keeping those participants happy and as a long-term client. So sometimes you might feel that you have to, from a business point of view, make a decision to have a small hit to keep the participant in the long term. But that's only so much you can do that with the small margins. So
yeah, and that's a really good point. Two things that just you made me think of. Firstly, it's just such a testament to your experience in NDIS that you know that. There's so many accountants. Well, actually, let's phrase it the other way. I don't know if there's very many other accountants who understands that the human side of this is actually a really important part of the business model, and actually what the business model is about. It's not just, okay, well, that's the cheapest resource, that's the resource that goes out. So it's amazing you know that, firstly. Not amazing, but it really demonstrates your expertise in the space and why it's so important to have an accountant who understands the space to that level of detail. Because the advice that you would give would be very different to someone that was just looking at the numbers alone.
That's right.
So that's amazing. Secondly, when you were talking there, it really flagged for me the importance of that whole knowing when you're going to take a loss. And in the NDIS space, it does seem that there are quite a lot of times that a provider has to, maybe by design from the NDIA, I don't know, I'm just maybe speculating, but it's almost like the provider picks up the tab. And so there might be a time where a SIL participant doesn't get the right amount of funding. And so I've seen, I'm sure you've seen more than me, but I've seen quite a lot of times where a participant needs one-on-one supports, but they're only funded to one-on-2 supports.
That's right. Yes.
Or 1-on-3 supports. And the provider has to almost pick up the slack of providing that extra staff at their own cost, because if they don't, the participant's going to be endangered or a staff member is going to be endangered. And so is there another way to manage this, or is this all just about having a cash flow buffer and managing your cash flow?
I don't have any magic answers around managing managing the NDIA. I see a lot of frustration out there of participants not being given enough budgeted funds. My advice is to go in with your eyes wide open. So I think the biggest problem is if providers aren't across it and haven't done the numbers, and they might get a few months in and then find that the budget's run out or something because they've gone in blindly. So I think the advice is to make sure that you understand how much funding the participant has, looking at how you can structure your supports in the most cost-effective way, but that also delivers their needs. Working with them, perhaps matching them with the participant with another participant where there's also some buffer that you can do some shared support staff, if that's practical and able. Of course, it depends on the circumstances. And then making an informed decision as to knowing how much funding that you have available to utilise and can map out the timing. I guess the other thing is, are there any other ways that you can potentially provide supports from a private sector point of view, or look for funding from a private sector? Again, not always practical in this space. So it really comes down to making informed decisions and having the information available in front of you and doing your numbers. Yeah.
I think another, this is more on the business strategy side than a finance side, but I think also having, as you said, looking for other ways of getting income and diversifying your income. So if NDIS funding stalls for some reason, like we have these payment locks that have become, popular. Yeah, if someone's got a payment lock and they're not receiving NDIS funds, then maybe you're also a home care provider and get home care funds, or a CHSP provider, or maybe you also have a for-profit business. Like as one of my clients who they have a really good branding, and they actually sell merchandise, and their merchandise actually does sometimes is the extra cash buffer that they have that funds those periods of time where funding might be stalled for whatever reason, or they need to provide an extra staff member for a 2-hour shift here or there that isn't going to be covered by the NDIS. So thinking about other income streams. For me personally, as a business owner, I never like to just have one income stream.
No, I agree.
I think it's very risky. And that's why I do multiple things, and that's why I try to get my clients to think outside of just the NDIS alone. Is there any other strategies that you can think of that might help providers in that situation?
So you pretty much hit the nail on the head. Diversifying the revenue, I think, is very important. But it's also monitoring the participants' funding, what's left remaining in their plan, and having a process in place that you are monitoring that. So making sure that you're not over-delivering on your supports, but also not under-delivering. So getting to the end of the plan and finding that there's so many thousands of dollars that hasn't been delivered and claimed during the year, that if you had managed properly, you could have perhaps done some additional supports during the year, and making sure that you're capturing all of the revenue that's available to you.
Yeah. That's a really great point. Using as much of the plan as you can and tracking the plan is really important. And I believe that's become harder recently in PACE than it was previously.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, but definitely something you need to do. I've been told that there's also some really amazing systems that you can use that track it live, so you can see live tracking now that it's no longer available inside My Place itself. But yeah, that's definitely managing that. And I guess the last thing that you've made me think of during your last response was just around this idea of cash flow buffer. In my business, I try to aim for 3 months worth of expenses as a cash flow buffer, because for me, the worst patch that I'm going to have, if I have no clients at all for 3 months, it would be very unlikely. But I would imagine in a SIL home specifically, there might be 3 months that you don't have that you have a vacancy in a SIL home. On average, with the SIL providers you've worked with, is there a number you would aim for a cash buffer?
Yes, it's very common that people can have either vacancies, or they can have delays in being paid for the SIL funding. And yes, majority of my clients normally aim for around about the 3-month buffer to have those funds, because you're still paying the staff and all of your other costs of running your business for that period of time, and not able to not always getting all of the income in a timely manner, which is what you're referring to. So 3 months is the amount that I normally recommend that clients aim towards having. But it depends, of course, depending on if they have other revenue streams, or if they've got that diversity in place with their income, or other, and not just NDIS diversity. Sorry, when I say NDIS diversity, I mean other income sources outside of the NDIS. I also mean you might also offer supports that are other than SIL within the NDIS, but maybe more regular paid, that you're able to invoice on a more regular basis, which will help buffer the SIL. So some things to think about.
Yeah, so that's kind of like having a strategy of I'm going to have 20% of my clients community access, 30% SIL, and I don't know how, another percentage left over of 50% left over. See, I'm so great at maths. 50% left over for doing, I don't know, complex nursing, something.
Exactly.
So just diversifying what services you deliver, I guess, is one diversification. And then you've got, diversifying outside of the scheme as well. Are there any other financial strategies or practices you recommend to ensure long-term sustainability for SIL providers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've already touched on it. in looking at the costs of delivering the supports compared to the income funding that you're getting for the participants. So doing out your financial model for each house, but then also not just having that as a set and forget process. So reviewing it regularly, because things change, as we know. The price guide changes, the SCHADS Award rates change, participant funds may change, or their utilisation might change. So coming back and checking the house profitabilities semi-regularly is a good idea. Also doing an overall financial cash flow forecast for the business as a whole, and then monitoring that on a monthly basis is vital. We've already talked about having the cash reserve in place as another strategy to help manage you through difficult times of difficult cash flow times. Yeah. Yep.
Wonderful. I think that's all really great strategies. Is there anything else so today, if we're to recap, today we've talked about managing ratios in SIL. We've talked about understanding the disability worker cost model. We've talked about some of the implications of things like overtime and public holidays, the kind of consequences for mismanaging or not being aware of payment delays. We've talked about some financial strategies around cash flow buffers and managing and tracking your cash flow and expenses. Is there anything else you think that's really important for SIL providers to understand when it comes to their finances?
So it really just comes down to being on top of it on a regular basis. So Tania, I think that today we've covered all of the key components to think about from a financial perspective. I just can't reiterate enough how important it is to be monitoring how the business is performing on a regular basis and to really know those numbers. You mentioned earlier in the podcast that you struggle a little to see where the numbers might be out. But once you are monitoring those numbers on a regular basis, patterns emerge really quickly, and you would look at a piece of paper with the numbers, like the monthly figures, for example, and if there's any anomalies, they'll just stand out immediately, and it just gives you reason to then go and dig in a little bit deeper. I know for myself, because I'm dealing with numbers all of the time, I can pick them really quickly, and I'm sure that if business owners were monitoring their numbers regularly, they would find those discrepancies really quickly as well. Yeah. That's great advice too.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Melissa. If there are people who want to get in touch with you to find out how you can help them better understand their SIL financials, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, so our website is avantiaccountants.com.au, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Cool. That's a wrap on this episode of SILosophy. If this resonated with you, take a second to subscribe and share it with someone in the SIL space who really needs to hear this. Don't forget to connect with Tania Gomez Consulting on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for more resources, conversations, and support to help you grow your impact. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep making a difference.